I wanted to share with you an important presentation that I attended at the ICEP International Conference for Environmental Psychology in Vilnius, Lithuania, June 2025. This specific presentation is it really at the crossroads of family psychology and environmental psychology, and as well as it highlights research methods. So this is field studies, and it's about an intervention that being tested in Sweden inside the women's shelter. This presentation was presented by Lymeus in collaboration with Freddie's colleagues from the Upsala Women's Shelter as well as Upsala University in Sweden, and it's called Strength to Move On. This is Lymeus, the presenter for this specific talk. Essentially, they laid out first the background so that we understand what's happening with intimate partner violence, IPV, a global perspective. 25% of all adult women in the world have experienced some type of psychological, physical, or sexual partner abuse. This has been prioritized by the United Nations, the World Health Organization, and the European Union, as well as many governments, as a devastating form of violence for women and human rights violations, as well as public health challenges. So there are many research needs when it comes to interventions for intimate partner violence. They use prior theories that have been developed and tested, and things that could affect and help women get through intimate partner violence. They've tested programs that treat the perpetrators as well, so those are being developed, but there's very little here on how to help the victims besides educating them and helping them help prevent the intimate partner violence. So here it is, the gap in the research that they've identified. This circle and Venn diagram shows the different types of violence that are inflicted. They don't feel physically safe, digitally safe, economically safe, spiritually safe, sexually safe. These are all the threats to the victim of intimate partner violence. Here are some environmental challenges that they presented. The home becomes a place for isolation. So here it is, the connection between a family psychology and environmental psychology. Because the home is a place, environmental psychologists studies our places of being, our places of living. And so the home becomes a place where victims of intimate partner violence become isolated to inflict violence and control on them. And there's disruptions in many of their places of being, their school, their work, their home as well. And they lose safe place. There's an unsafety, a feeling of unsafety, of relocation, of disorientation. And forgive the background noise, I'm in a hotel lobby right now. Their living conditions are also unsafe, and there are tight constraints on them, as well as concerns for their security. In Sweden, here, they have women's shelters as well, and this is what they offer to the women. They shelter them, they provide legal and educational assistance, as well as support. They have support groups with them as well. But of course, they have constraints, as well as, probably all the shelters around the world where the staff isn't completely permanent. They may rely on volunteers, maybe victims that have left their abusers and are helping in shelters as well. And they often find they don't have enough funds, obviously, to continue the shelter here. So this program called Strength to Move On is really aiming at the women's shelter and evaluating an intervention that they've created to help the women develop practical skills so that they can then move on to a new life after leaving their abusive relationships and develop positively after being in these relationships. They did have positive outcomes where they have a well-adapted intervention, and there's initial evidence about the positive effects that this intervention has on the women. And of course, they hope to spread this intervention out throughout shelters in Sweden. So they had two research questions. How can this be integrated with and contribute to the regular conditions and practices in the shelter? So can this become part of the regular practice in a shelter? And they wanted to do this by interviewing the shelter staff. And then the second research question is, what effects do these this intervention have on the women or the victims of abuse who have left their abuse? And are they able to help them break free from that lasting impact of having that environmental insecurity? So this is kind of the project timeline. You can see they broke it down by organization, intervention, and evaluation. And then they went on to set the timeline here, fall, spring, etc. And they show you kind of how they worked out their project. This project seemed to be in collaboration with several institutions, a women's shelter, 2 universities, and so forth. So there's a lot of work behind the scenes here before the intervention is tested. They have to develop it. They have to pilot test it. As you can see here in the fall, they pilot tested the study with 8 women from the Upsala, I think it's women's shelter. And then in the spring, fall, and spring, they began to test it in like their lab environment. They did begin to add a control group of women that did not get this intervention so that they have a point of comparison to see if the intervention did indeed result in better outcomes for the women who did receive the intervention, and then not as good outcomes for those that did not. Of course, with control groups, you always want to offer the intervention to the control group once the study is over, especially if it did provide good benefit. And then here are 3 activities that they described in this study, and they described this in this, I thought, was the really interesting part of the presentation and of their project. 2 specifically, the tree, and that was an activity, and I will show you in just a second. And then my safe places, which was a spatial map. That was also really interesting. And then they did a sensory meditation from a program they had used before. They didn't really describe this very much, so I'll just really focus on the first. So they talked about their shelter environment, that they feel like the women feel that the shelter is a safe place. They have a good environment for them, and they do exercises. They feel like, they're safe there. So you can read those comments there. This is the first activity they described, and part of the intervention. They asked the women, if you were a tree, what kind of tree would you be? What would your leaves look like? Would you be rooted? What would you need to eat? What would you need to feel safe? You can see the comments from the women here. One of them said you had to describe yourself as a tree and do an interview with each other. And it feels weird at first, but it can probably be quite good to think of yourself as something other than who you are. What images and thoughts you get and what they symbolize. One helped me to understand myself, who I am, and what I need to feel good, and so on, etc. You can read the comments there. And then this last one, it was called Safe Places. And here are the instructions that they gave the women. First, they need to draw a figure representing themselves. They can draw symbols representing up to 5 of the most important safe places in their lives. And then draw lines to represent connections between them and the places, and between the places themselves, anything they can do to improve the safe places. And so this one was really trying to help them visualize places where they feel safe. This picture, they did say that they used Microsoft Copilot, I think, to create, so AI to create this picture. And this is what came out. Here are some comments from the women, feedback that they gave the shelter staff or the research project regarding this activity. So here are their conclusions. Of course, intimate partner violence involved many still poorly understood environmental factors. Remember, this is the crossroads of relationship psychology and environmental psychology. They really were focusing on the places or the spaces that the women live in and making them safe. Reorientation to life after leaving an intimate partner violence situation can kind of leverage several environmental mechanisms here. The shelters being safe, nature metaphors. Environmental psychology is very interested in studying nature as a healing component. So they did also explain a lot of the studies that they used using nature as a restorative mechanism. And of course, engaging with their senses and restoring safe places, mapping out and developing a new life space once they leave this violent situation.